Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 27th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being Influence on this view on the right understanding of military history and on the foundations of theory. The text follows. We see, therefore, in the first place, that under all circumstances, war is to be regarded not as an independent thing, but as a political instrument, and it is only by taking this point of view that we can avoid finding ourselves in opposition to all military history. This is the only means of unlocking the great book and making it intelligible. Secondly, this view shows us how wars must differ in character according to the nature of the motives and circumstances from which they proceed. Now, the first, the greatest, and the most decisive act of judgment which the statesman in general exercises is rightly to understand in this respect the war in which he engages, not to take it for something or to wish to make of it something, which by the nature of its relations it is impossible for it to be. This is, therefore, the first, the most comprehensive of all strategical questions. We shall enter into this more fully in treating of the plan of a war. For the present, we content ourselves with having brought the subject up to this point, and having thereby fixed the chief point of view from which war and its theory are to be studied. So this is an amazing paragraph, as you understand, also the one before the last, before the end of the chapter, and in it, von Clausewitz reveals us fundamentally did we get to this point for, at least in a part that up to this time had partially not covered, as in fact he is presenting it as the conclusion of that we can draw as a result from the theory fundamentally, and for the theory, as we will see also in the next paragraph next time. So quoting the same von Clausewitz here says, we see therefore in the first place that under all circumstances war is to be regarded not as an independent thing but as a political instrument, right? So we have repeated this many times. The last paragraph is very eloquent about, very explicit about this, and it's always the most important Clausewitzian fundamental, that war is nothing but a political instrument, and it stays this way. Then he goes on and says, and it is only by taking this point of view that we can avoid finding ourselves in opposition to all military history. So if you have followed the videos of this chapter, you realize that von Clausewitz basically starts from a sort of abstract view of war that would be the unrestrained one, the absolute one, that is the one that is uncontrolled, unrestrained, as if politics or any other factor that can interfere into war, even from a sheer physical point of view, in terms that war is waged in a physical world, in a material world, didn't exist. So the procedure that von Clausewitz has followed was to insert paragraph by paragraph a new element that fundamentally gives you this greater depth into the war phenomenon, tells you, yeah, theoretically, war should work in a certain way. You should work effectively for making to compel your adversary, your enemy, to fulfill your will. You should exercise as your forces strongly as you can. You should do a lot of things, but showing what real war is about, so not absolute war, but let's say real war. He shows us this extreme, this absolute can never take place. So what happened in the process is that the logic that he had initially drawn to describe this abstract and absolute war now takes us to reflect on how effectively real war is mitigated by certain factors that in this sense shouldn't really be there. I mean, they're a sort of an obstruction or an impediment, something that it kind of makes us grow distant from the original absolute foundation. But that at the same time is what really happens in the real world, and these are not things that you can eliminate, because we are fundamentally all about that, and it's impossible to talk about an absolute war that is not even just as a pure concept. It's not even applied to the physical world at that point, and this is very interesting. So step by step in this procedure, what emerges is that all these factors bring to a limitation of the logics, and therefore this logic gets virtually annihilated by reality. And therefore, when you study military history that is supposed to be real, I mean about real events, so things that happened in history and that you can study, then whether you understand them correctly is well another point that pertains to the historical research. But however, if we look at history, and we will see how important in the Clausewitzian doctrine military history specifically is for the art of war, and should always be studied, because otherwise you can't understand war in the first place, because there's not this is one of the greatest perils that von Clausewitz tells us. You fundamentally can't pretend that war exists in a purely abstract fashion that you can ideally draw. I did it because I showed you how this effectively is. If you were to draw one, but at the same time I demonstrated you how this is impossible in reality to happen, and therefore theory must definitely also be useful to practice, and you have to observe war from a different perspective. This is what von Clausewitz is telling you, because lots of other scholars, of other thinkers now, we're trying to go directly into the opposite way, to abstract everything from reality and saying, the theory, the absolute is like that, and that's what we are interested in, and the rest is just something that happens by accident, that shouldn't happen. But as a matter of fact, in real war, that happens all the time, and therefore you can't take that out of the military theory when you get to study real war, and when you hopefully want to even fight and not hopefully fight, but hopefully win one, in the case you find yourself into one. So in these paragraphs, von Clausewitz has presented this contradiction, this opposition, as he calls it here, to between the absolute theory and military history. So he says, having now arrived at the end of this logical chain, and having observed step by step what are the factors that in reality affect absolute war, now we understand why military history that functions in a very different way from that is not in opposition with the absolute. This is another very important thing to bear in mind, because you don't dismiss the absolute, you don't dismiss the theory as such, not even the abstract in a certain measure, but you have to be able to make them coexist. That is to say, you never have to miss the point of what war is and how it works, and what it would be supposed to be if it was unrestrained, if it was absolute. At the same time, being aware that in the reality there are so many other factors that intervene. So if you want to win one, you have to take constantly into consideration the absolute, but also the relative, and that's how you can start observing war and military history if you want to understand something about it. So there is no contradiction. The contradiction between the absolute and the relative is understandable, is acceptable, or better, it doesn't really exist, as a matter of fact. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, this is the only means of unlocking the great book and making it intelligible. So this is another beautiful phrase that introduces the taste in that it expresses actually the taste in introducing the idea of that there is a whole lot of things to learn about when we talk about war. That military history is indeed something extremely vast and complex to understand, into which many factors intervene, so that you can't just study, and we will see now, even indirectly in the following phrases now, that you can't just study war the way it is exclusively from a military point of view. That is to say, the fight only, in pretending to understand war in itself. It doesn't work like that. In order to understand war, you have to understand political theory, you have to understand philosophy, you have to understand physics, you have to understand languages, you have to understand religion, you have to understand lots of things that ultimately have to do with the trinity of in Clausewitzian theory, made up by politics, war, and the people, the masses, right? So that is the only way to understand war, but not just from an historical point of view, but actually from a real and strategical point of view, as von Clausewitz will explain us now in a few phrases. So the metaphor in here, unlocking the great book, making it intelligible as well. So there is a sort of different stages of intellectual understanding here that it wants. First of all, you have to understand that the book exists in the first place and be able to open it. And this is very important. It's probably the biggest obstacle in any intellectual achievement, is fundamentally learning of something that we didn't know it existed, and therefore of something that we apparently don't have the instruments to interpret, to understand, or maybe we have, but it's still something new. It's and different from what we learned before. And secondly, we have in fact to go into it and to try to read it, to understand, right? So if von Clausewitz is saying is, if you want to understand war, this is the only way you can do it. And there are no other ways. There are no other interpretations. If you don't accept the assumption that war is nothing but a political act and a political instrument, an act of violence, etc., you can't fully understand the whole story in the first place. And this sounds very theoretical as an intellectual exercise, but I can assure you that it's really widespread. I mean, the general approach to war is pretty similar. I mean, people talk about and read and listen to a lot of war, right? Just, switch on TV, the news, wherever you get them from. It's a big part of our history. It's a big part of our past. Fortunately, at least from certain perspectives, not much of our present, but that the last decades have not been exactly what some of the most absolute and pacific in world history. Some kind of we fortunately live in a very peaceful world in relative terms, but very wars that are fought today, are keeping being fought, are very important for our own lives very directly. Actually, isolationism doesn't pay very much in this circumstance. We can't pretend that what happens out there doesn't have an impact on us. It does, and it's very heavy. And therefore it's also civically meaningful to even worry, to get worried about war and the detachment that seems to be existent between, especially in our Western world, between the real war and one that we have. Maybe the same real one, but maybe the one of the past, the one that has grown distant. We live in many ways in the mythology of war. In many ways, especially in the masses and pop culture, we start growing detached. My generation, basically not even the one of my parents, went to a world war. So this is something that affects. Obviously certain countries participated to many wars, but we grew distant. There is a let's say a sort of forgetfulness about what war really is and the interest that exists. And this is a very fascinating topic, actually, that now I presented it very banally, but it has lots of implications because, for example, already I think still our parents, albeit being actually the children of those who had fought into the last World War, were believed in a world that was pretty to which war played an important part, even though it was mostly, unfortunately, just Cold War. But we know that obviously it was also hot in many circumstances, in many countries, and that even the political language and of those times was full of ideas about war, conceptions about war. And many misunderstandings that were born at the time actually still affect us probably very negatively. It's still, and partly because war was not observed, and the same ideology surrounding the conflict, and was very politically bended. I mean, very ideologically bended to politics, let's say better. And this has ruined even our critical skills and an objective approach to it, and sometimes it will depends on the countries. Definitely, if I don't know, if you take the Vietnam War, this had a much deeper impact in the West, and known as that more, than the United States, obviously. Other countries didn't quite have that, and even if you look within NATO, for instance, just to stick to the West, every country had kind of its own perspective, then just not for talking for the Warsaw Pact countries or or outside of them. There are different views. So also this difference is partly what makes a good starting, acknowledging it at least, is what makes a good starting point to understand a bit more politics and military instrument that is being used, as you understand, pretty widely, even today, after all. So it's and it will always be used. I mean, at least will always remain an option on the table of politics, as von Clausewitz brilliantly explains. And if the 20th century, 19th, 20th, or 21st century history showed us, as the whole rest of history, by the way, is that the Clausewitzian paradigm is way more than just confirmed. It's basically von Clausewitz got it right. This is how it will always be like, and there is no way to change it. And I hope with this series to wake a little bit, even the curiosity. I'm not saying now the conscience or the let's say conscious problems or awareness broadly meant, but let's really listen what this thinker had to tell us, because it turns out that not only it was right, but it's not a matter of who is right or wrong in here. It's really a matter of what concretely happens, and Clausewitz happened to decipher it for us and to present it in a way that, by the way, is the way, at least through which all the military in the world, all the militaries in the world are basically reasoning through. Like, I mean, we live in a largely Clausewitzian world when it comes to strategical culture, and that's where all the military theorists got inspired by. And then but they tried to go past von Clausewitz. They failed because there is nothing to go past to. This is how effectively history works. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. So, excuse me. So he goes on. Let's go on. It says, secondly, this view shows us how wars must differ in character according to the nature of the motives and the circumstances from which they proceed. Now, this is also very, very poignant. We have observed it naturally in the last two paragraphs, mostly the one on the diversity and the nature of wars, and the one on wars to be all considered as political acts. And here von Clausewitz repeats it in this phrase, and it puts the emphasis naturally on the motives and the circumstances from which wars proceed, so that you can't understand war if you don't understand its motives and its circumstances, so that war never happens by chance, like a spontaneous chemical reaction. It's something that has very deep roots, and it may evolve and break out from a very complex and even difficultly intelligible movement of many factors. Remember the metaphor of the constellations in the political sky in the last paragraph. Well, that's rendered pretty poetically, but also well the idea. So this is simple. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, now, the first, the grandest, and most decisive act of judgment which the statesman in general exercises is rightly to understand in this respect the war in which he engages, not to take it for something or to wish to make of it something, which by the nature of its relations it's impossible for it to be. Well, quite long period, but the meaning is pretty clear. That is, do not think of war what is not. That you both the here von Clausewitz is calling both the government and the military, says the statesman and the general. Sometimes they're even the same person actually. They're never disjuncted, as we have just repeated to the nausea almost, is in fact that war is just an instrument of politics. So you can't think that there are two, there are, as we've said also pretty frequently, there are two distinct domains. One thing is politics, one thing is war, but the two things are never disjointed, not even for 1 second. There is not let's say a moment in which the war in its fight, in its progression, is detached from policy. It never happens. There is always a control of it. So here the warning that von Clausewitz is saying is that do not think that war is something that basically resolves it in itself. War is always an instrument. So if you really want to use it, you don't have to believe it as an end to itself. It's just an instrument. It's just a mean. It's just a medium. It's something you use to obtain something else, and that is modulated and not just merely used like a tool, but it's something that has to reconfigure itself in its development, and it changes constantly to achieve something else. So it's constantly subordinated to something else. So you can't think of it to be just an isolated dimension that solves magically, takes out the rabbit from the hat, as if all the rest didn't have any importance. So this is also a very meaningful statement, but meaningful concept that we have encountered many times at this point. That is always very important to make because, as we were saying also rather often now, we are, by the way, excuse me if I'm repetitive, but it's kind of, I want to I think repeating is also helps to memorize in some way. But we were talking about the emotional impact of war and how we our attention is polarized. It's instinctual. War is such a messy, chaotic thing human mind gets automatically attracted to it. If you wonder why we love war as something so terrible, we are so fascinated with it, to study it, to read, to study about military history for all our lives, etc. It's because it's effectively a very difficult problem to solve. Not even system, because there is not any real scientific approach. There is only a kind of artistical approach to war. That is, you have, as always, to consider war as an art, not as a science. There is nothing, not even remotely close to an art of war, a science of war. Excuse me. But war is an art in the Latin etymological meaning of the term. That is, this sort of craft that you have to master in some way, and that requires theory and practice at the same time in order to be mastered. So, and the general statement logically is also very clear. You can't pretend that reality bends to something unreal, So you have to take things for what they are, and war is effectively the one that we have described. Like, von Clausewitz goes on and says, "This is therefore the first, the most comprehensive of all strategical questions. We shall enter into this more fully in treating of the plan of a war." So here von Clausewitz readdresses to eventually something we will be talking hopefully in a few videos, that is planning. So we are in this field of strategical matters that therefore are also deeply intertwined with policy. What's the political mandate of wars are, so that even the military has to modulate its plans according to the mandate, not according to an abstract logic that fell from the sky, right? And yeah, so we will. He says we will see that later, essentially. Then he concludes by saying, "For the present we content ourselves with having brought the subject up to this point, and having thereby fixed the chief point of view from which war and its theory are to be studied." Very, very clear. Clausewitz is happy about having finally drawn these fundamentals that you have to observe war theoretically from, and theoretically here not meant abstractly, but from the theory, really the theory you have to study in order to understand war. And having fixed the chief point of view from which war and its theory are to be studied in turn. So the reasons also why this is the case, and why you can't observe the thing from another perspective. So these are you see how effectively the Clausewitzian prose is very simple. There is it's very logical, very rational. In certain traits, is even pleasant to read, as he uses very effective, poignant lines. He's poetic sometimes. He was definitely a very talented and sensitive person, and yet the whole message is very clear, and yet it is clear only once that you make your brain work on it. So it's counterintuitive, and this is normal, especially in this case, because this is a rational point, and our tendency is to be instinctual. So this is how. But in this, there's this beautiful parallelism you can trace, because war is exactly the same thing, in compared to individuals. I mean, individuals are kind of more instinctual and more sympathetic towards violence in itself, and to its indiscriminate or kind of primitive or unreasonable use, while what actually happens at a social level is that wars, however, are fought in a rational way. And this is very interesting because it means that in some ways we are programmed to work socially in a way that we don't even rationalize, because it's also part of our, not really just of our instincts, of course, but in the part of the combination that that individuals are able to form when they get together. They act in collectively, they act in group, right? So that's why war is different from just a brawl. So it's not. There is still this intrinsic enmity and conflictuality. Von Clausewitz has himself defined war as just as a duel on a large scale, because it entails that the definitely there are these aims and these interests, etc., that you can observe into a duel, just as in a clash between titanic political entities and social and human groups, etc. But also historically, war is something organized rationally. It's not just in fact, a simple act of aggression by everybody. It's an act of violence. It's used through violence. You can't eliminate violence from war. As a matter of fact, trying to reduce violence from war is paradoxically even more harmful than in terms of losses. Then this is also you realize how it's counterintuitive, and that's why it's beautiful, because it's something that's more difficult to picture, I think, to accept at the very beginning. And that's why so many people find culturalism so seductive, because it's more tribalistic, it's more instinctual, and that's why they criticize von Clausewitz, because simply they don't understand it, because it's something more intuitive, something easier, so more direct, less intellectually committing than what von Clausewitz says. And unfortunately for them, it's wrong, and unfortunately for the rest of us, because by accepting those interpretations, what you do is just, in fact, damaging your own world, damaging your own society. So I don't want to sound too pretentious, but I believe that we have a duty to change things by expanding the awareness on the Clausewitzian theory, because we live in a world where we have this knowledge from almost 200 years, and yet very few people have metabolized this, have processed this, they have realized that it's out there. Of course, it would be great already if we can get everybody could have a satisfactory school education at this point, but that's still part of the process. That's still, even the teachers, even people who are meant to prepare the others to educate others, should start from principles that are intrinsically rational, but also moral, and also not relativistic. Definitely what von Clausewitz is not is a relativist, and this is a great problem in our day, and I believe that culturalism is brutally relativistic, and that's heavily damaging for our own society. We can't accept that. Here we go far beyond, and the same Clausewitzian method and model of investigation is particularly effective in this sense, because here von Clausewitz is not hiding you anything. He is telling you literally step by step what he's meaning, and he wants you to follow him step by step, because he is confident that the evidence that he provides is accurate, is correct, is the right one. And in fact it is, and therefore it's not just a, people listen maybe this name and say it's very resounding, you think, this von Clausewitz, this great military theorist, how difficult it is to approach that thinking. When I was written, there must be one of those very books with lots of pages and thickly written, and yes, it turns out it is. But once you start it and you go by tiny bits, as we're doing right now, everything you realize everything is clear. So don't feel repugnance towards something that is particularly, towards the text that is particularly long and complex in its structure. Because if you, start to assimilate it step by step, there is nothing you have to fear. And especially in this case, it's all self-explanatory. You don't have to. There are some passages of the Clausewitzian thought that may sound kind of. Something is interpretable, I give you that. That there are certain passages that are not so immediate. At least you should be an expert. You should know the original language. You should also have a kind of a philosophical, scientific, and also a deeply historical education in order to interpret it. I'm trying it a bit with the means I'm able to put together. I'm telling you, as always, since the beginning, I'm not a real expert on von Clausewitz, as a matter of fact. But the more I approach him, and the more I realize that aside from certain passages that are objectively are not easy, there are many times this word Begriff in German that it's difficult to frame to give it the right translation. But if you follow the thought, it's very intuitive what von Clausewitz writes, and you don't have to make a huge effort. The problem is when you start quoting, like picking things from supermarkets shelves, and you pretend to just picking the quote because it sounds cool, and then you don't know the context, you don't know the thought, and you use even a bad translation that you don't understand. You haven't made a great effort and pretend to start on that base. But if you follow him, even if you're not an expert, you can read it, you should study it actually, but it's comforting. I mean, it really makes you understand that it's you can trust him. There's nothing sneaky here going on. It's crystalline clear, it's fair, it's honest, and especially it's rational, it's concise, it's straightforward. He doesn't go very much for the tangent. He tells you, like me, by the way, but he tells you things very directly, very very straightly, and it gives you at the same time the space for thinking it, for understanding it, and that's why it's also very it's really inviting to read him, because he's meant to be understood differently from from many other thinkers of his own times, by the way, including philosophers and other theorists, etc. And okay, so next time we will read the last paragraph of the first chapter, and we'll get finally into the second one. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you